While the initial appearance of this new world is, to begin with, only the whole veiled in its simplicity, or the general foundation of the whole, the wealth of previous existence is still present to consciousness and memory. Consciousness misses, in the newly emerging shape, its former range and specificity of content, and even more the articulation of the form, whereby distinctions are securely defined and stand arrayed in their fixed relations. Without such articulation, science lacks universal intelligibility and gives the appearance of being the esoteric possession of a few individuals. An esoteric possession, since it is yet only present in its notion or its inwardness. Of a few individuals, since its undiffused manifestation makes its existence something singular. Only what is completely determined is at once exoteric, comprehensible, and capable of being learned and appropriated by all. The intelligible form of science is the way open and equally accessible to everyone, and consciousness, as it approaches science, justly demands that it be able to attain rational knowledge by way of the ordinary understanding. For the understanding is thought, the pure I as such, and what is intelligible is what is already familiar and common to science and the unscientific consciousness alike, the latter through its having afforded direct access to the former. There are two main things going on in this section. One of them, which I already have sort of sketched out on the board, has to do with this contrast between two different ways of looking at the new world that's developing. The new world and the old world are kind of interfused, and I don't want to linger on that too long because I want to say what the second thing is. The second thing is Hegel is going to begin to lay out some of the desiderata, the criteria for what is actually going to count as scientific knowledge, systematically developed, and is going to introduce a new portion of that criterion. So far we've got that, it has to be systematic, has to take account of itself. There's a number of different things, but this is going to be something new. But first, let's look at what's actually going on here. So he talks about consciousness as being caught between two different polarities. And I'm actually going to begin with the second one. He begins bringing up this notion of a wealth of previous experience. And what we're talking about there is, we've been exploring this new world, the metaphor of the baby, the child, and the old world that is tottering, that you can tell is beginning to disintegrate through this qualitative leap that's taking place through quantitative growth. Why are we still holding on to that? Well, it still has a great attraction for consciousness in general, if we want to think about it in terms of society or cultures, and for individual consciousnesses. This is part of what in phenomenological terms used later on we would call the life world, or Hegel will actually call substantial life later on in his phenomenology. And what is so attractive about this? Well, there's a wealth of content, as he calls it, not just wealth, but a range and specificity of content. So the things that we're familiar with, think about, for example, the transformations that are taking place today with online education. This is a prime example. When online education first began, and I would say, here's the dirty little secret about it, for the most part, still today, people would transpose the categories that they already knew. They thought you could just upload a bunch of content, and you might be changing the form slightly, but really we're wedded to the 15-week semester, or the 10-week semester, or the 12-week semester, whatever it is that we're used to, and we got to do grades in a certain way. And how are we going to get around the fact that we don't have a lot of interaction? Discussion forums, that'll substitute for that. And discussion forums are like face-to-face interaction. You see where this is going, right? People are used to things that actually work, that they have experience with. And they may be, they may be not working as well as one thinks. One can tell oneself all sorts of stories about that. But at least they have some specificity, and at least they have some structure that we understand. He talks about form going along with content, and this is a duad or dyad that's going to show up a lot in Hegelian thought. Not only do we have range and specificity of content, we have the articulation of form, the articulateness. So form gives us distinctions, it helps us anchor those distinctions, it helps us differentiate things from each other. The content gets to be content by being structured by form. So we have this in the form of the old world, and we realize that the old world has cracks in it. It's not, our conception of it isn't fully adequate, and there may be, great bifurcations where we understand the world of work this way, the world of the family this way, the world of religion this way, and the different systems don't map onto each other. But at least they have what appears to be a sort of richness to them. By contrast, the new world, what's being developed, where the dialectic is going, is merely the general foundation of the whole, or, as he said before, the notion of the whole, and the notion in its primary, undeveloped state, where it's really a universal that risks being an abstract, empty universal. So this is going to bring up the issue of science. He says, without the kind of articulation that we have over here, science, which is what we want over here, can't really be what it's supposed to be. It's going to lack universal intelligibility. And it gives the appearance of being the esoteric possession of a few individuals. This is going to lead us to the second part now. So we want to think about the nature of what Hegel has been calling science. Science wants to develop itself in a certain way. It wants to unfold itself. And when a science comes on the scene, a new way of knowing, a new way of articulating things, it appears to be the esoteric possession of a few individuals. So what does all this mean? So esoteric is opposed to exoteric. Esoteric means that it's coming from the word for inside. Exoteric would be the outside, the shell. So think of something where there's a story being told, and the story is actually supposed to illustrate a greater point. So there's an exoteric meaning, like take a fable, right? Aesop wrote all these moralizing tales where, for instance, the fox, or the dog, we'll use the one about the dog. The dog has a bone in its mouth, it goes along, it sees another dog, which is really itself, in the water, and it barks at that dog and it loses the bone. So you can say, okay, well that's a neat story. That's the exoteric portion of the story. What's the esoteric inside moral? Well, maybe keep your mouth shut. Or when you've got something good, hold on to it and don't worry about who else there is that has something similar. There could be more than one esoteric meaning. But what Hegel's calling science risks becoming something merely esoteric. And why? He says, an esoteric possession, since it's yet present only in its notion or in its inwardness. So, insofar as we're just talking about the beginning of a notion, the beginning of a concept, the beginning of a begriff, it's esoteric. It hasn't been fully developed yet. You have to be in the know in order to make sense of it. Why is it the possession of just a few individuals? Because he says its undiffused manifestation makes its appearance something singular. So now you might say, well, what does that mean? Its undiffused appearance, its undiffused manifestation makes its existence something singular. It's not happening everywhere. There are selected places. So, think for example about some of the things that are bursting on the scene at this time. One of the things that people are always Well, I'll take two of them. One of them I brought up before. Another one is one that I haven't talked much about. So think about mindfulness and how everybody's talking about that these days. And you know, if you pin them down on it, it's often kind of vague about what exactly it means. Turns out it's sort of like meditation practices from some Eastern philosophies, although you can find a lot of these in Western philosophies, light. That is stripped away. And you know, you're supposed to focus on the present and on your sensations and not try to bring a lot of things to the experience. Really, you're doing phenomenology, but you're doing phenomenology light. Now, is that something that everybody's doing? On a certain level, you know, you have to be doing that or you can't actually be conscious. But as a movement, it's not something super widespread. That's why you can have gurus that, you know, lead workshops about this sort of thing. Same thing with, you know, think about neuroscience. This incredible burgeoning of all sorts of fields. Neuroscience is going to transform this. Neuroscience tells us about that. Morality, dating, you know, business, education. Everybody's got to talk about neuroscience, and they produce these great, you know, scans of the brain. Now, can you do brain scans all the time? As it turns out, no. You can only do them under extremely narrow circumstances. People got to sit still. You got to do the imaging. Now, the imaging that we can do is really quite cool. And so within those very particular niche experience ranges, we can actually learn quite a bit. I mean, now you've gotten to the point where you can like map out not just, you know, like big portions of the brain and whether they're lighting up or not lighting up. You can actually see what's connected to what. So, but is that widespread? No, that's really just the province of a few individuals. These are what we call nascent sciences. And they may, in fact, turn out to measure up to the hype that they bring about, or they may not actually turn out to be that way. They may turn out to be the new phrenology. If you know the history of that pseudo-discipline. We have to wait and see. It has to become articulate. It has to no longer be the province of a few individuals. It has to be no longer esoteric. Hegel says that only what is completely determined is at once as exoteric, comprehensible, capable of being learned and apprehended by all. That's what science tends towards. It's open. It's manifest. It can be learned by all, at least in theory, perhaps not actually in practice. You know, in our own society, you have to tear people away from Netflix and you know, other things that are occupying them on the internet and whatever other occupations they have in order to get them to do that. But in theory, a lot of things could be learned by anybody who wants to apply themselves to it. And that's what science tends towards. So he says, the intelligible form of science is the way open and equally accessible to everyone. So this is a very democratic, very egalitarian concept of science. It's not actually lowering science to, you know, the lowest common denominator, saying, well, you got to make it so simple that even somebody who doesn't do any cultivation, any mental work can get it. Because that's not going to work. I mean, we're talking about sophisticated, systematic conceptions of reality here that do require some development of the person. But they should be able to be available to everybody. So he says, consciousness as it approaches science justly demands that it be able to attain to rational knowledge by way of the ordinary understanding. By way of the, you know, enfranchised ordinary understanding, the disencumbered ordinary understanding. For the understanding is thought, the pure eye is such, and so it should be able to take it in and make sense of it. The new world that we're beginning with in this passage is not yet at that point. And taking on the determinacy that the old world had with form and content, that's going to be an integral part of the development of science, of philosophy as scientific. Science in its early stages, when it has attained neither its completeness of detail nor perfection of form, is vulnerable to criticism. But it would be just as unjust for criticism to strike at the very heart of science as it is untenable to refuse to honor the demand for its further development. This polarization seems to be the Gordian knot with which scientific culture is at present struggling and which it does not properly understand. One side boasts of its wealth of material and intelligibility. The other side at least scorns this intelligibility and flaunts its immediate rationality and divinity. Even if the former side is reduced to silence, whether by the force of truth alone or the blustering of the other, and even if in respect to fundamentals it feels itself outmatched, it is by no means satisfied regarding the said demands, for they are justified, but not fulfilled. Its silence stems only half from the triumph of its opponent and half from the boredom and indifference which tends to result from the continual awakening of expectations through unfulfilled promises. In this paragraph as well, we've got a kind of two-step going on where the first part of the paragraph is setting out a kind of problematic, and then the second part is bringing out some other aspects of that very problematic. In this case, it's going to center on what Hegel calls a Gordian knot, and I'll tell you about that in just a moment. First, I want to look at what he's actually saying at the beginning. So he says that science early on, science as it's not fully developed, is vulnerable to what? To criticism, to somebody dismissing it, to somebody saying, well, you're not truly scientific, or you don't really grasp reality as such, there's things that you're missing, to dismissal altogether, this is not the way to go. And Hegel says that that's unfair. Why is that unfair? Well, because science, by its very nature, and what he's meaning by science, remember, is not just what we tend to think of as the scientists in the labs and Stephen Hawking and people like that. What he means, nor is it just the popularizations of science, the people who do the Sage on the Stage thing and do TED Talks. What he means is this process of trying to develop rigorous, systematic knowledge that can actually take account of itself and that can make sense out of the historical process by which it developed. That's a big undertaking. So science is not complete. He says it's not complete in its details. That has to do with content. That means that for any given point in time, there's more that it has to take in. And you can think about this. There's even the sciences that have been around for quite a while, like say biology, they're still discovering new species. As a matter of fact, newer sciences like the branch that studies viruses just recently discovered these large viruses that operate in a somewhat different way. And when that happens, when they discover these, they're like, I think we got to do some rethinking of the very nature of our activity, of what it is that we're studying. So sometimes finding new content isn't just a matter of filling in gaps that you had. It actually says, well, I think there might be more gaps out there. We're not even really quite sure where the gaps are. And that leads us to the second part. Science is not perfect in its form, in what we were calling articulation. Remember, science, in order to really be science, it has to articulate the content that it has in a way that actually does justice to what it is that it's attempting to study and its own self as the one who's studying it. That's a big order. So science is going to be continually developing. This is the natural course. It's not a process that you just finish up right away, and it's not a process that comes up with its own scientific method, which then it applies cookie cutter style to everything that's out there. That's actually bad science. Scientific method has had to be reconceived over time. And if science, as philosophy, is really going to be truly scientific and talk about the totality, that means that it has to become adequate to the things that it's studying, even if those seem to be non-scientific at first. That means that science has to stretch, to use a term that Hegel's not using. So Hegel says science needs further development. It requires that. And so to criticize it on that basis is a little bit unfair, because that would be sort of like saying a child who is not yet an adult is therefore wrong for not being an adult. No, it's part of the natural process is the further development that has to take place. And part of that development that often gets left out is that science has to develop an adequate understanding of what it is doing itself, what it's about not in the sense of the subject matter, but what it's about in the sense of what is it actually engaged in and how does it do that. So he talks about this as bringing about a polarization, which is the Gordian knot with which scientific culture is at present struggling, and which it does not yet properly understand. So Hegel is going to help us now to understand for the science of his own time, and perhaps this applies to our understanding in our own time, what this Gordian knot is. So while I do a little bit of erasure and writing things up here, let me tell you the story of the Gordian knot. When you use that expression, it refers to this really intricate knot that was I don't know what it was made of. I'm assuming yarn, because that was a common thing at the time. And this was in ancient Greece. And the story of the Gordian knot concerns Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great is supposed to have run across this knot, and to be able to untie that would actually be quite a feat, not only of patience but of wisdom. And nobody had been able to do it. So how does Alexander untie it? He gets a sword and slices it in half. That's thinking outside the box in a certain way, isn't it? Because you are untying the knot, but you're not untying the knot in the sense that you were supposed to. And so Gordian knot is sort of a byword for a puzzle that is really difficult to solve, perhaps impossible to solve, and which you might solve only by producing some sort of split, some sort of bifurcation. And he talks about this as a polarization that scientific culture has fallen into. So you've got two sides. You've got the one and the other, just so we can stick to the terminology used here. So the one side boasts of its wealth of material, and its intelligibility. That means everything is able to be understood. And the other side boasts of immediate rationality and divinity. So what have we got going on here? We've got a lot of content and a lot of form, and then we've got the ones who think that they're getting to the real heart of the matter. We've seen this already with the appeal to intuition. The appeal to intuition can take the form of the beautiful, the true, God, religion, transcendentalism, this notion that, look, you can jangle around all you want with concepts and appearances and discursive knowledge. We're penetrating to the heart of the matter in a way that you can't possibly do, nor can you even understand. You stick in the mud empiricists over here, or rationalists, by the way. This is something quite different. And so these two sides are kind of fighting with each other. And it makes sense, because you can pile up a lot of data, a lot of information, and you can even organize it and curate it, but you can still ask the question, what the hell is the point? What are you actually getting at? What is this really about? And that sometimes seems to require some sort of getting things as a whole. These guys are focusing on the whole, the totality, but unfortunately they're reducing it to something, you know, what we've seen as not really deep, is superficial, something that's in many respects arbitrary. These guys are going about the, you know, workmanlike process of putting things together, but they're losing sight of, as we say, the forest for the trees. These guys are all forest, these guys are all trees. And he says that this side over here, at least in this paragraph, even if this side is reduced to silence, whether by the force of truth alone or the blustering of the other, because people over here do bluster quite a bit, and even if in respect of fundamentals it feels itself outmatched, it's by no means satisfied regarding the demands. For the demands that science is imposing, this Gordian, this Gordian knot of science, that things make sense, that things be systematized, that things be put into a whole that can not only, contain everything, be completely exhaustive, be comprehensive, but actually make sense of itself in a reflexive way. These guys are claiming, hey, we're doing that and you aren't. And these guys are saying, I can see that that's important, but you guys aren't really doing that. You are making a claim that is, I want to use these exact terms again, these demands are justified but not fulfilled. It's one thing to say that you're going to do something, or that the project that you're working on is really an important project, and that can be true. It's a whole other thing to make good on it. And these two sides are left with this split in a kind of scission. He also talks about the silence of this side stemming from the boredom and indifference which tend to result from the continual awakening of expectations through unfulfilled promises. And again, over here, we might think about this as, the big picture meaning. The people that are the ideas men or women who are going to put everything into perspective, they come out with some sort of, here's the idea you got to get. And again, we could say mindfulness. And a decade from now, nobody's going to be talking about mindfulness anymore, and it'll be some other trendy thing that's on the scene. And, the mindfulness thing will be just one more branch of the study over here. The problem is, these guys never make good. It sounds really cool. It sounds like, yeah, this is going to revolutionize things. This is going to help me fit everything into perspective. But the problem is, who's good at fitting things into perspective? The one who can actually articulate things, the one who actually has some sort of schema, some sort of arrangement, some sort of what Hegel's calling form.